I found out my parents hid the truth about my real father for 30 years. Growing up, I always thought my family was like any other. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. My mum and dad had been together for as long as I could remember, and while they had their share of ups and downs, there was nothing that ever suggested something wasn't right. They loved me, they raised me, and they made sure I had everything I needed. So I never questioned it, never even considered the possibility that my entire identity was built on a lie. For 30 years, I lived my life assuming the man I called Dad was, well, my dad. It wasn't something I ever doubted. I mean, why would I? My parents never gave me any reason to think otherwise. Sure, I had some differences from him. I didn't share the same features. Our personalities didn't always match. But that's normal, right? Not every child looks exactly like their parents. It wasn't until I turned 30 that everything changed. It started with a casual conversation, a seemingly innocent family gathering. We were sitting around the dinner table, my mum, my dad, my siblings, and me, reminiscing about old times, telling stories about when we were kids. My mom was always the nostalgic one, always pulling out photo albums and telling us about the good old days. I never minded it. I loved hearing about my childhood and the memories they had shared. But that night, something was different. My mom had a strange look on her face, a mix of guilt and anxiety. She kept glancing at my dad, as if silently asking him for permission to say something. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe they had an argument earlier, or maybe she was just tired. But as the night went on, her unease became more noticeable, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Finally, I asked her what was wrong. She hesitated, her eyes shifting nervously to my dad, who remained silent. The room suddenly felt tense, the light-heartedness of the evening evaporating in an instant. I could feel my heart start to race, a strange feeling creeping up the back of my neck, as if I knew deep down that something was about to change. My mom took a deep breath and said, "There's something we need to tell you. Something we've kept from you for a long time." The air seemed to grow heavier. I glanced around the table at my siblings, who looked just as confused as I felt. My dad still didn't say anything. He just stared down at the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, and I could barely get the words out. "What are you talking about?" My mom's voice wavered as she began to speak. "It's about your father, your biological father." I froze. Biological father? The words didn't make sense in my head. My biological father was sitting right across from me, or at least, I thought he was. I didn't understand. Was this some kind of sick joke? She went on to explain that when she was younger, before she met my dad, she had been in a relationship with another man. It was a brief, complicated relationship, and when it ended, she discovered she was pregnant. At the time, she didn't know what to do. She was young, scared, and uncertain about the future. She told the man she was pregnant, but he wasn't interested in being part of her life, or the child's life. So she moved on. A few months later, she met my dad. He knew about the pregnancy, and when I was born, he stepped in and raised me as his own. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who helped me with my homework, who tucked me in at night. He was my father in every way that mattered, except for biology. I sat there, stunned, unable to process what I was hearing. My entire body felt numb, as if the ground had fallen out from under me. I could hear my mum talking, her voice trembling with emotion, but her words felt distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away. It was like I had entered some alternate reality where nothing made sense anymore. How could they have kept this from me for so long? 30 years. 30 years of living a lie, of thinking I knew who I was, only to find out that the truth had been hidden from me my entire life. I looked at my dad, the man I had called Dad for 3 decades, and for the first time, I didn't know who he was. Or more accurately, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had so many questions, but I couldn't find the words to ask them. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding with each other as I tried to make sense of the situation. Why hadn't they told me sooner? Did my siblings know? Was my biological father still alive? Did he ever wonder about me? I asked the only question I could manage. Why now? Why are you telling me this now? My mum's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain. We didn't know how to tell you. It was complicated and we didn't want to hurt you. Your dad, he loves you. He didn't want you to feel like you weren't his child. We thought it would be easier if you never knew. Easier. They thought it would be easier. Easier for them, maybe, but for me? I felt like my entire life had been ripped apart in one conversation. The people I trusted most, the people who had raised me, had been lying to me from the start. I couldn't even look at them. I stood up and left the table. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't sit there any longer. I needed air. I needed space. I needed time to figure out how to process this bombshell they had just dropped on me. Over the next few days, I barely spoke to my parents. I couldn't. Every time I thought about what they had told me, I felt a surge of anger, confusion, and betrayal. I knew they had their reasons, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. How was I supposed to reconcile the life I thought I knew with this new reality? How was I supposed to look at my dad? No, the man I had called my dad, the same way again. It took weeks before I finally gathered the courage to ask about my biological father. I didn't even know what I was hoping to find out. Did I want to meet him? Did I want to confront him for abandoning me before I was even born? Or was I just searching for some missing piece of myself, something that would help me make sense of who I really was? When I finally asked my mom about him, she hesitated before giving me his name. He was still alive, she said, but they hadn't spoken in years. He didn't know anything about me, at least not that she was aware of. She offered to help me get in touch with him if I wanted, but she didn't push it. She left the decision up to me. It took me a long time to decide. Part of me wanted to leave it all in the past, to pretend like none of this had happened and go back to the life I knew before. But I couldn't. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. I needed answers, and the only person who could give them to me was the man I had never known. Reaching out to him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wasn't even sure what I expected. An apology? An explanation? A connection? I didn't know. But I had to try. When we finally spoke, it was awkward and uncomfortable, like talking to a stranger. In many ways, he was a stranger. He told me he hadn't been ready to be a father back then, that he had been young and scared, and that he didn't think he could give me the life I deserved. He said he regretted it, but I could tell by the way he spoke that he had made peace with his decision long ago. I left that conversation feeling conflicted. I had found the answers I was looking for, but they didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. In the end, I realized that the man who raised me, the man who loved me, was my dad, regardless of biology. But the pain of the secret they kept still lingered. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. But I'm trying. We're all trying. The truth may have come out 30 years too late, but now that it's out, all I can do is figure out where to go from here.